On a March afternoon in 2002, the town of Walton-on-Thames, in Surrey, was wrapped in its familiar calm. Along Station Avenue, the last light of day stretched into quiet golden streaks across the pavement, glinting off the windows of houses and the cars parked neatly along the curb. At 3:47 p.m., in the middle of what seemed like an entirely ordinary day, 13-year-old Millie Dowler pulled out her phone to call her father. Her voice was cheerful and innocent as she told him she would be home in about half an hour. On the other end of the line, her father could never have imagined that these would be among the last words he would ever hear from his daughter. After school, Millie and her friends stopped by a small snack shop near the train station. The two girls chattered happily over simple food, chips, fried snacks, a few fizzy drinks, talking about homework, classmates, and the little things that, at 13, felt as important as the whole world. Outside the window, the silhouettes of passing trains slid by slowly, and the station announcements echoed steadily in the background. Around 4:05 p.m., their meal ended. The two stood up and straightened their jackets. Millie's friend waved goodbye before getting on a bus heading toward her home, while Millie turned away and continued walking alone along the road that led home, a path she had walked countless times, so peaceful that the word danger felt unimaginable. It was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. At around 4:32 p.m., a nearby security camera captured a brief image of a red Daewoo Nexia passing along the quiet road. Just a fleeting frame, a small car, an empty street, nothing remarkable to anyone watching casually. Everything looked perfectly normal. A calm afternoon, a car rolling by, a young girl walking home. Yet only minutes later, Millie's presence seemed to dissolve from the world. She would never walk through her front door again. From that moment on, the tranquility of Walton-on-Thames shattered, leaving behind a dark mystery waiting to be unmasked. You can almost imagine the agony Millie's parents endured as the hours dragged on without a single sign of their daughter. Dinner cooling untouched on the table, the clock ticking relentlessly, the phone remaining silent. A flurry of calls, the same desperate questions repeated over and over. "Where are you? Has anyone seen her?" All met with silence. If you find this case compelling and want to follow more true crime stories like this one, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. But for now, we return to where it all began, the brief, bright life of Millie. Amanda Jane Dowler was a 13-year-old student living a quiet, ordinary life in Walton-on-Thames. Her parents, Bob and Sally, spoke of her with unmistakable pride. A child who was cheerful, lively, playful, always bursting with energy and laughter. Her older sister, Gemma, often recalled the afternoons when the two of them would chase each other around the garden, hide behind bushes, scribble shapes in the sand, then collapse into fits of laughter until they forgot it was time for dinner. In the family's memories, Millie remained a talented, friendly girl, thoughtful, easy to get along with, diligent at school, but never losing the innocence of early adolescence. Millie's life revolved around the simplest of routines. Mornings at Heathside School, recess spent huddled with friends, afternoons practicing for school performances, activities she loved because they gave her a chance to express her talent and enjoy being on stage. She adored music, and she had spent an entire week excitedly preparing to attend a Will Young concert. The family still remembered how she glowed afterwards, her eyes lighting up as she recounted every song, every moment on stage. All those little details painted the portrait of a girl at the most beautiful age of life, full of dreams, full of promise. None of them could have imagined that a girl like her was about to face a tragedy so brutal it would haunt all of England. That afternoon, when Millie stepped out of the snack shop and into the gentle evening light, no one knew that the line between her ordinary life and a looming nightmare had thinned to almost nothing, just a single step. Misfortune struck without warning. As if someone had switched off a light in the Dowler family's world, Millie vanished without leaving behind a single clear trace. As daylight faded and dinner approached with no sign of her return, her parents tried to calm themselves at first. Perhaps Millie had stopped by a friend's house. Perhaps she missed her train. Perhaps she was caught up in a conversation somewhere. But with each passing minute, the air in the house grew heavier. Bob and Sally realized something was terribly wrong. They called the police, and from that moment on, their normal life was torn apart forever. A massive search operation was launched immediately. More than 100 police officers were deployed. Helicopters swept across the skies over Hersham and surrounding areas, with infrared cameras scanning every field, every line of trees, every bend of the river. On the ground, search teams fanned out everywhere, from small canals and riverbanks to grassy meadows and secluded footpaths, trying to find even the faintest sign of the 13-year-old who had disappeared in broad daylight. Detectives who had worked on the Sarah Payne case were brought in as well, a clear indication that police were treating this not as a case of a teenager running away, but as a likely violent abduction. The media quickly became involved. Newspapers and television channels repeatedly broadcast Millie's photo, her brown hair, her bright smile, the warmth in her eyes. BBC's Crime Watch UK reconstructed her final known movements that day, urging any possible witnesses to come forward. Even singer Will Young, whose concert Millie had been so excited to attend, recorded an emotional plea addressed directly to her. "Millie, your mom and dad and your whole family love you and miss you so much." It was more than a message to a missing girl. It was the voice of a family drowning in despair. No one had any answers. Days turned into weeks. Sheets of the calendar were torn away without bringing a single piece of news. Local businesses, organizations, and individuals contributed money to offer a reward for any information that might lead to Millie's return, clinging desperately to the faint hope that she was still alive somewhere. But the longer the wait, the more that hope eroded. The Dowler family's emotional journey shifted slowly from confusion to hopelessness. Eventually, deep down, they were forced to confront the very fear every parent dreads. Their daughter might never come home again. The official investigation, codenamed Operation Ruby, was launched with the initial goal of finding a missing girl. But as time went on, investigators felt as though they were navigating a tunnel with no light at the end. Rumors surfaced everywhere. Some claimed to have seen Millie in a strange car. Others insisted she had been dragged into a truck. Someone swore they heard screams in a nearby park. Every statement, every tip was logged, pursued, only to collapse back into nothing, betraying the fragile hope it had momentarily created. It wasn't until September 18, 2002, nearly 6 months after Millie vanished, that Operation Ruby entered a new chapter, one no one had wished for. That day, a couple out foraging for mushrooms near the edge of Yateley Heath Woods in Hampshire noticed a suspicious-looking pile of straw. As they moved closer, they saw something lying within it, and in an instant, they realized they had stepped into a real-life nightmare. Police and forensic teams quickly sealed off the scene. The body discovered had decomposed so severely that visual identification was impossible. In the heavy silence of the forest, specialists began their meticulous, clinical work. Days later, the results came back. The remains were confirmed to be those of Millie Dowler, identified through dental records her family had previously provided. The forensic report revealed that she had been killed roughly 2 days after she disappeared, meaning that while her parents and the entire country were desperately searching, praying, and appealing for help, Millie had in fact died very early on. Further analysis concluded her cause of death. She had been strangled. What made the tragedy even more painful was the absence of any clothing or personal belongings at the scene, as if someone had deliberately stripped away every trace, every fragment tied to her identity and her life. From that moment, Operation Ruby could no longer operate as a missing person search. It became a homicide investigation, one of the most serious and haunting cases police had faced in years. To answer the question, who brought Millie to this forest, police practically turned the entire region inside out. They set up tents at the forest's entrance, established checkpoints, photographed, documented. For days, thousands of vehicles were stopped and inspected, and approximately 6,000 drivers who passed through the area around the time of Millie's disappearance were questioned. Investigators explored multiple theories, including one that would later force the police to issue a public apology. The early belief that Millie may have willingly approached or gotten into a car with someone she knew, since no witness had reported a clear abduction at the time. That line of reasoning placed suspicion, however thin, on her father, Bob Dowler. Though there was no evidence against him, the shadow of doubt inflicted another layer of pain on a family already shattered by loss. Later, once the truth emerged, police admitted their mistake and formally apologized to the Dowlers, an ethical scar that would linger long after justice began to take shape. In the months and years that followed, investigators clung to even the smallest detail. In March 2003, a glimmer of hope appeared. A male DNA sample was discovered on old clothing of Millie's found in her bedroom. This raised optimism that someone who had been in contact with her before she disappeared might have unknowingly left behind biological evidence investigators could finally trace. But after thorough analysis, the results delivered yet another blow. The DNA was ruled out as unrelated. A door that seemed on the verge of opening slammed shut once more. In that vacuum of despair, disturbed individuals seeking attention began to emerge. One man, later prosecuted, sent threatening letters to the Dowler family claiming he was the killer while fabricating gruesome details to torment them. From prison, he wrote again, falsely confessing to Millie's murder, forcing investigators to waste time and resources verifying his lies. Others impersonated witnesses, calling or messaging Millie's mother, her friends, even the police, insisting Millie was still alive and being held somewhere. Each call ignited a flicker of fragile hope, only to be extinguished when proven false. The most cruel of these came from a volatile man who emailed claiming Millie had been trafficked abroad, forced into prostitution and exotic dancing, a scenario both vicious and inhumane. Eventually, every one of these individuals was arrested and convicted for causing distress, obstructing the investigation, and exploiting a family's grief for their own warped satisfaction. Yet despite digging relentlessly, for 6 long years police found no new lead strong enough to point to a perpetrator. The Millie Dowler case slowly drifted toward the realm of ownerless crimes, with no identifiable name behind the horror. Until one day, a breakthrough emerged, not from a new crime scene, but from a courtroom in London. On February 25, 2008, Levi Belfield, already a suspect in multiple attacks on women, was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murders of 2 young women, Amélie Delagrange and Marcia McDonnell, and for the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. When his file was shared across police units, Operation Ruby investigators immediately noticed chilling parallels: the pattern of targeting young females walking alone, the method of approach and attack, the geographical movements, and most disturbingly, the recurring detail of a red Daewoo Nexia. From that point on, the name Levi Belfield quickly rose to the top of the suspect list. Investigators began reconstructing his movements and behavior in March 2002, cross-checking them with every detail they had gathered over the years. And just 1 month after Belfield was sentenced for the London murders, police officially arrested and charged him with the abduction and murder of Millie Dowler. After years of sifting through fragments of evidence, Operation Ruby had finally closed in on the man who turned a peaceful March afternoon into a nightmare. Levi Belfield grew up in an environment steeped in violence, familiar with fighting and petty theft from a young age, gradually slipping into the orbit of men who lived off intimidation. A wheel clamp operator, a nightclub enforcer, the kind of man who lurked around bus stops late at night, where young girls stood alone in the dark. In West London, the media would later give him a chilling nickname, the bus stop killer, because most of his victims were young women attacked on their way home, walking alone after a night out or a late shift. Belfield's record was a mosaic of escalating brutality, Former partners accused him of controlling, beating, and imprisoning them. Neighbors were used to the sound of him shouting and smashing things. Police had repeatedly logged reports of assaults on women, though not every incident resulted in enough evidence for prosecution. Before Millie Dowler's name ever appeared on the list of victims, Belfield had already been convicted of murdering Marcia McDonnell and Amélie Delagrange, two young women attacked near their homes simply for walking or waiting at the wrong place at the wrong time. He had also attempted to kill Kate Sheedy by deliberately running her over, as if the streets were his own private arena, to experiment with power over the bodies of women. Seen in hindsight, the pattern becomes chillingly clear. Young women, often alone. Locations familiar to Belfield. A car used as the approach tool. A sudden attack, then disappearance into the darkness. To him, Millie Dowler was simply another link in that predatory chain. A 13-year-old girl walking down a road whose bends and pavements he knew by heart. No further explanation was needed. Police understood they had finally found the right man. After 6 years of wandering through darkness, Operation Ruby had seized the thread that led straight to the person who ended the life of a child. Someone who had stood in plain sight within the community, smiling, chatting casually, all while hiding a cruelty no one could have imagined. Piece by piece, the evidence aligned into a single red line, and that line pointed to one name. Levi Belfield wasn't an outsider drifting into town. He grew up in Walton itself, just yards from where Millie vanished. Station Avenue lay right inside the territory he knew intimately. When investigators re-examined the camera footage showing a red Daewoo Nexia passing through the area at the time of Millie's disappearance, they realized it wasn't some anonymous coincidence. It was the car belonging to Belfield's girlfriend, and he later admitted he was the one driving it that afternoon. Records also showed that just days before Millie disappeared, there had been an attempted abduction near the same area. The victim's account, how the car pulled up close, how the driver lured her with words before shifting into sudden violence, carried the unmistakable signature of Belfield's hunting style. But even when his shadow loomed over every corner of the case file, extracting the truth from Belfield was anything but easy. Everyone who had ever sat across from him in an interrogation room described the same thing. A large, hulking man with eyes as cold as stone, sitting in deliberate silence, as if answering questions were a game he had no interest in playing. On the way to court, he remained expressionless, sometimes even smirking when the names of his other victims were mentioned. It was a smile that sent chills through the courtroom. For years, Belfield refused to say a single word about Millie. He denied, deflected, or simply stared back in silence, leaving the Dowler family trapped in a cruel vacuum of unanswered questions. It wasn't until late 2015, when police began investigating whether he had acted alone, that the wall of silence finally cracked. According to investigative reports, Belfield suddenly confessed everything, as if he had decided it was finally time to showcase the brutality of his game. In his confession, he didn't describe Millie as a human being, but as a target who appeared at the right place at the right time. That afternoon, on the path Millie always took home from school, she slipped into the sightline of a predator. Belfield intercepted her, coaxed her, then overpowered her, dragging her back to his flat. Right in broad daylight, in the middle of an ordinary residential neighborhood. There, according to his own words, Millie was beaten and threatened until she could no longer resist. After asserting full control over the terrified 13-year-old, Belfield drove her to his mother's house. A detail that shocked many, because it should have been a place of family, safety, sanctuary. But to Belfield, nothing was sacred. He admitted to assaulting Millie right there at the front gate. He then transported her to a third location, more remote and isolated, where he said he continued to abuse her for hours. Finally, just about 14 hours after Millie vanished from Station Avenue, Belfield strangled her to death, ending a sequence of violence that had long abandoned any trace of humanity. When Millie's body was found 6 months later in the Yateley Heath woods, her family and the public learned only that she was gone, but not why there were almost no signs of resistance. Belfield's late confession cast the picture into cruel clarity. Millie had been overpowered from the very first moments, psychologically and physically beaten into a state where she no longer had the capacity to fight back. She didn't give up on life. Rather, the world around her had been crushed into silence by the walls, the locked doors, and the empty stretches of road where no one could hear her cry for help. Faced with the file and his statements, criminal psychologists found no trace of remorse in Levi Belfield. Behavioral analysis showed him to be the kind of predator who thrived on absolute power, someone who enjoyed watching victims break, freeze in fear, and be stripped of dignity. He had no conflict, no grudge, no personal motive against Millie. She was simply a lone girl walking down a street he happened to be prowling, a target that appeared in front of him. A judge in one of his other trials once called him a ruthless, remorseless murderer, a man whose capacity for evil seemed to require no reason at all. Many British newspapers described him bluntly as a cold-blooded psychopath, a textbook example of an offender society could only neutralize by removing forever from the public. Within that reality, Millie Dowler does not appear as the tragic figure in an isolated personal drama, but as the random victim of a man driven by dominance, thrill, and the desire to control. Someone who viewed women and girls as objects for satisfying his urges and asserting his power. The horror lies in this. There was no logical reason, no understandable motive, for why she had to die. It was clear the killer had never planned specifically to target Millie in advance. Levi Belfield's trial began in May 2011 at the Central Criminal Court of Old Bailey in London, a place that had judged some of the most horrifying criminals in British history. In the public gallery, Bob and Sally Dowler sat pressed tightly together, their fingers interlocked so hard their knuckles turned white. They had waited nearly 9 years for this moment, not for revenge, but for one single word: guilty. Throughout the proceedings, the prosecution laid out, step by step, everything the Dowler family had spent years trying not to picture, the path Millie walked on Station Avenue that afternoon, and the final hours she endured in Levi Belfield's hands. Each detail presented to the court felt like a fresh blade reopening an old wound: the red Daewoo Nexia, Belfield's predatory pattern, his chilling confession describing how he abducted, imprisoned, abused, and killed Millie. But what ignited public outrage across Britain was not only the brutality of Belfield's crimes, it was the way Bob and Sally Dowler were treated on the witness stand. During cross-examination, Belfield's defense barrister attempted to implant an entirely different narrative in the minds of the jury, that Millie might not have been the cheerful, carefree girl her family described, that perhaps she had run away due to instability within her own home. To push that argument, he dredged up intimate details from the early stages of the investigation, details that should have been buried long ago, along with the system's mistakes. Bob Dowler, a grieving father who had not only lost his daughter, but had once been treated as a suspect, was forced to answer in court how Millie had discovered adult magazines in his bedroom, and whether that might have made her distressed enough to run away from home. He was also compelled to confirm that police had once found certain intimate items stored in the loft, private objects belonging to him and his wife, now dragged into the harsh light of a courtroom packed with reporters. Sally Dowler, meanwhile, was questioned about her relationship with her 2 daughters, pressed repeatedly on whether she favored the older daughter Gemma over Millie. As if losing a child were not enough, she now had to defend the authenticity of her love for the one who was dead. By the time her testimony ended, she nearly collapsed in tears. Court officers had to help her off the stand before she fell into her husband's arms. Technically, those questions were legally permissible within the boundaries of defense strategy. But to the public, they felt like a ritualistic stripping down of a grieving family, an emotional dissection conducted under the glare of cameras, forcing them to expose the most private corners of their lives just to prove that Millie had not run away, that her family was not the source of the problem. After the trial, newspapers, legal commentators, And the victim's commissioner condemned how the justice system had allowed witnesses, especially the parents of a murdered child, to be emotionally crushed in such a way. The Millie Dowler case ignited nationwide debate about reforming how vulnerable witnesses are questioned and how to protect them from interrogations that amount to psychological violence disguised as legitimate defense. Meanwhile, in the dock, Belfield remained almost expressionless. At times, he looked away. At other moments, he stared up at the ceiling, as though everything being said belonged to the story of someone he had never known. On 23 June 2011, the jury returned to the courtroom. When the verdict, guilty, was read aloud for the kidnapping and murder of Millie Dowler, Sally clutched her husband's arm, tears bursting forth uncontrollably. The judge then sentenced Belfield to a whole life term with a special order. He would never be released. No minimum years, no hope of parole, only a sentence that sealed shut every door that could lead him back to freedom. A man who had stolen the lives of innocent young women would spend the rest of his days behind bars, confined to a space as small and as dark as his own mind. After the verdict, Bob and Sally Dowler stepped out before the crowd of reporters waiting outside the court. Their faces carried the deep lines of sleepless years, of interrogations, of endless days waiting for news that never came. Sally, her voice breaking with grief, said they felt a small sense of relief that their daughter's killer had finally been convicted, but that feeling was immediately swallowed by a pain beyond words. To bury a child under any circumstances is unbearably painful, she said, but to bury your daughter, knowing she died in such a horrific way, it is suffering beyond expression. It was not a statement crafted for the media. It was the exhausted breath of a mother whose heart had been carved open. Standing beside her, Bob tried to remain composed, though his eyes had been red for a long time. He said the family had paid a very heavy price for justice. Simple words, but the weight of them caused many who stood there to lower their heads, because while society could finally exhale, knowing the murderer would die in prison, the Dowler family felt no such relief in the true sense of the word. They had paid with the most precious thing of all, a child on the verge of growing up, with dreams and plans still ahead, exchanged for a verdict confirming what their hearts had known for nearly a decade, that Millie's life had been stolen by a man unworthy of being called human. Nothing could ever compensate for what was taken from Millie Dowler. For many people in Britain, every time her face appears, it evokes not only the memory of a single victim, but an entire period when parents lived in fear that their own children might vanish in broad daylight. In an effort to turn grief into something meaningful, the Dowler family created Millie's Fund. Its mission was to raise awareness and protect children and teenagers from violence, harassment, and abduction, to promote education on personal safety, danger recognition, and support for victims' families. Over time, Millie's Fund became part of the legacy she left behind, not through the things she might have achieved as an adult, but through the story of her life. From the tragedy of a 13-year-old girl, her family and community worked to build safeguards for children who came after her. But the Dowlers' ordeal did not end in the criminal court. Nearly a decade after Millie disappeared, they discovered another truth, one that reopened their wounds all over again. In the early weeks after Millie went missing, her mobile phone had been illegally accessed by journalists and private investigators working for the tabloid news of the world. Using voicemail hacking techniques, they listened to, recorded, and extracted messages for the purpose of building stories. What made it even more devastating was that some messages had disappeared from Millie's inbox. At the time, the family believed this meant Millie herself had listened to them. Proof, they thought, that she was still alive. For one brief moment in the middle of despair, Sally had told her husband, "She's checked her voicemail, Bob. She's alive." That spark of hope was later exposed as nothing more than a side effect of unauthorized access, messages being listened to, then deleted, by people seeking headlines. When The Guardian exposed the scandal in 2011, public outrage erupted across Britain. If even the privacy of a victim's family could be violated for the sake of selling stories, then where did the moral boundaries of journalism truly lie? The pressure on the media conglomerate that owned News of the World became so overwhelming that the 160-year-old newspaper was forced to shut down entirely. From the Millie Dowler case, and from many other victims caught in the same phone hacking scandal, the UK government launched a public inquiry known as the Leveson Inquiry. Its purpose was to dissect the relationship between the press, politics, and power, and to re-examine what the media had allowed itself to do in the name of the public's right to know. Millie's story, stretching from Station Avenue to the Old Bailey courtroom, to the newsroom desks where her voicemail was played as if it were a source, became a focal point in a nationwide debate about journalistic ethics in modern society. What happened to Millie Dowler stands as a terrifying warning that even the safest-looking streets, the quietest towns, the most ordinary afternoons after school can hide danger when someone like Belfield is lurking in the shadows. It reminds parents to stay mindful of where their children are, when they are expected home, to teach them personal safety skills, to warn them not to walk alone on isolated paths, not to trust strangers too easily, and to know how to seek help when something feels wrong. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last lines. If you have thoughts, questions, or experiences you'd like to share, please leave a comment below. Your words might help someone stay alert, safer, or stronger. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss upcoming true crime cases where we not only recount tragedies, but also strive to learn from them, honoring the memory of every victim. Through the sorrow of Millie Dowler's story, may we all cherish our families more deeply, value every moment of peace, and hold on to the belief that justice, no matter how late, remains something worth pursuing. See you in the next episode.